Hello and welcome back to What is This Weapon with me, Jonathan. Three very, very similar things on the table here. These are kind of just illustrating this one, so let's focus on this. Now, you are possibly thinking, or thinking beforehand, if you follow along on social media, that this is a Smith & Wesson. If you got it, congratulations. This is actually a Spanish copy of the Smith & Wesson, the famous Smith & Wesson top break design, most famous with the number 3, but this is the Smith & Wesson double action design with the top latch. There are different generations of the double action Smith & Wesson. This is either the second or third model. It's not. I don't think it's quite close enough to either of those to be pinned down. Correct me if I'm wrong, Smith & Wesson experts, but the second and third model both have this round-ended latch for breaking open the revolver for reloading and loading in the first place, of course. So we're not too concerned about the mechanical side of it. These are more interesting for their historical relevance. There is an obvious difference here from the, well, I suppose a couple of obvious differences. The grip, I have to be very careful because this is a sealed pattern. I'll quickly show you the sadly rather deteriorated seal. For those of you who don't know, the sealed pattern system is how the British authorities controlled manufacture of firearms for quite a long time. Back to at least the beginning of the 18th century for firearms, and probably even earlier than that, you would get a literal wax seal of approval, royal seal of approval, to say that this example is how we want all of our others of this type to be made, whether that's in-house at the Tower or the Enfield factory or by a contractor. So it's always nice to get out a sealed pattern from the collection. It's not a prototype, as some people sometimes think. It's not the first one. It's from its early production, and it's to the exact spec required. Correct in every dimension and every appurtenance. It's probably what they would say in the 19th century. Don't know why that came into my head, but it did. So back to the differences. Apart from the markings on the top of the barrel, which we'll come back to in a moment, the big giveaways are the grip logo. In fact, I'll do this on the other gun, so I'm not waving the seal around needlessly. So we have a monogram of 3 letters here, which I will explain when we get to the markings on the barrel. So you would have the Smith & Wesson logo there, of course. Here you don't. You have a different one. And then this slightly weird overhang of the grip. So it's the grip frame, if you like, is what we would call a bird's head grip, shaped vaguely like the head of a bird. But the grip panels, the stocks, the grip scales, whatever you want to call them, which I think I've got a picture on these, they stop short. So they're almost like they're for the wrong gun, because there are plenty of revolvers that do stop with a flat base and don't have that bird's head shape. Broadly speaking, the bird's head shape of grip is late 19th century. There are revolvers with flat bases by that time, and that becomes the standard style. I guess it makes them a little bit more compact. Some of this is just down to fashion. Now, this is dubbed the #1 Mark I Old Pattern, or OP, and this is in British military nomenclature, because this copy of the Smith & Wesson, or rather 3 slightly different copies by different Spanish manufacturers, were adopted as the old pattern revolver in 1915. That's the story in a nutshell, in fact. Now, we have a total of 30,000 ordered, essentially from 3 different manufacturers, but all through Orbea, who are one of all these manufacturers are based in Eibar, in the Basque region of Spain. And this one had, or these two with the weird shaped grips, have the markings Garate Anatua y Compañía, which is one of the 3 companies contracted. And it just the other bit just says special manufacture revolver, essentially, and brackets Spain at the end. There is one more mark on here, which is a marca registrada, which is on the right-hand side, so registered trademark. So this is somewhat standard. And the ones that saw War Office procurement, and therefore probably British service, have War Department marks on them. Now this one doesn't. This one has private, or rather, civilian proof marks, London proof marks, Crown over GP, Crown over V. The ones with military markings, well, our sealed pattern, of course, has them. So we have a rather squashed version. So where my left index finger is, we have a very squashed version of the broad arrow, the Board of Ordnance / War Office property mark. It's sort of normally more elongated than that, more arrow-like, but this is harder to make out. And then below that we have Crown over V5 over, it's not very well stamped, E. That's an Enfield inspector's mark. So these were being, this at least was inspected at Enfield to get the pattern right. And then we have, and they sort of vary in location and size, and a little hard to make out, but we have the crossed pennants proof mark, so little flags basically, of the British military on this barrel. So that's the equivalent to those civilian proof marks, and that says this is, or would be in theory, if it hadn't been made the sealed pattern, an issue revolver. So I've mentioned 4.455 inch caliber, and the fact that these were military issue. Why is the big question? Well, we didn't have enough revolvers in 1915. So even though there were quite a lot of the Mark IV, 5 and 6, the 6 was brand new in 1915, Webley revolvers out there in the 4.55 caliber, there just weren't enough for the many men that were called up to fight. So these were what the Americans would call a substitute standard. So these were issued interchangeably in theory with the homegrown ones that were made to these very high standards. They work in much the same way. They don't have the stirrup latch on the side of the Webley, but a user would soon learn to pull up the toggle rather than press the latch. And they are dubbed old pattern, I suspect, for that reason, perhaps the shape of the bird's head grip, because those earlier Webleys were pretty much out of service by then. In any case, they called it the old pattern, which is sort of quaint in its own way. So I've mentioned 3 manufacturers. Well, we have 2 here from Garate Anatua. There was a sealed pattern for this version as well, and you should notice right away that this has the bird's head style grip, but the actual grips respect the lines of the grip this time, for whatever reason. I mean, these are sometimes called skull crushers. That's really just a descriptive term for anything with a protruding. In fact, if I point it that way, you can see why someone might call that a skull crusher. It gives you if you had to use it as an impact weapon, it might be a bit more skull crushy than a normal grip, but that's not its purpose. Especially not with a lanyard ring hanging off the bottom, which is part of the specification for these. It's more important that the user does not lose his sidearm and is therefore strapped to him via a lanyard than he's trying to use it as a club. And for whatever reason, this manufacturer, and this one is the Trocaula Aranzabal y Compañía Eibar España. Apologies, Spaniards and my Spanish-speaking colleague. If she was available, I would have got to come in and read this for us. So this is the second of the 3 manufacturers. I've actually already mentioned the third, which is Orbea. So very, very similar in basically all respects, really just the grip and the markings that gives it away. We have another form of trademark here. It says in English trademark, it doesn't say marca registrada. So different makers' marks, different grip shape, but you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference. In fact, given the variance in manufacturing, not necessarily quality, although that's a complaint to the British government when they reject a load of these, but in terms of the hand-finished. We've had interchangeable parts since Samuel Colt, earlier, depending on what location and how much money you have, basically. So that, in other words, drop-in parts that someone with no craft skill like me could just screw on and send down the line to the next stage of the production process. That is a thing, but even by the Second World War, we still have parts of the world, including in Europe, where everything is being hand-filed, hand-polished, hand-finished. And if it doesn't fit, you file a bit more off, and then you fit it. So that's very much how these are made. A-bar is well known, and much like Belgium and Birmingham at different times of history, they can make really good stuff, and they can make perhaps slightly questionable stuff, and it depends what you get. Now, if you are a major world government and you're trying to get substitute standard revolvers, you apply your standards, and that's where things went a bit wrong. Now, just to try to illustrate that, it may not be that apparent, but if we put the two by the same manufacturer together, the more you stare at these things, the more you'll see slight differences in every little detail, because a little bit more material is being filed off at a slightly different angle by each of the people that are making these. So, for example, this curvature here, hopefully see this on the camera over my head, that curvature there is different than this shallow curvature on the military version. And that's repeated across, so that slightly more rounded at this pivot point here. This is a bit more crisp. In broad terms, this is a beautifully made example, as you would expect for the sealed pattern. Partly that's because it hasn't been used or handled very much. So this colour case hardening here that you'll see on, say, Colt revolver cylinders, it's on the hammer here, that's still intact. That doesn't speak to the quality so much as how well it's been preserved. But still, there's quite a lot of variance in the manufacturing, not in theory in a way that would impede its functioning, but the British government disagreed on that. So there's almost as much difference between those two as there are with these two, but only in detail. So these aren't the situation is desperate enough in 1915 that these aren't the only substitute revolvers that the British buy. The Smith & Wesson Model 10 and the Colt New Service are also purchased in that .455 caliber. That's all they really care about. They want a similar, again, as the Americans would say, manual of arms or drills. So it handles broadly similarly. Double action trigger mechanism, of course, is pretty important for close quarter fighting. And they want it in .455. They need to be able to use the existing stocks and the future stocks that are going to be made, and then millions of that ammunition type. That's the critical thing. Now, officers bought their own, were responsible for buying their own revolvers in, again, that service caliber, so that's a whole other story. These were actually intended for issue to other ranks, which literally means all the other ranks apart from the officers. So, for example, a machine gunner might have a revolver sidearm. So 30,000 of these are ordered through Orbea, who is the sort of lead contractor. Weirdly, there is no sealed pattern for their version of the revolver. So the story there, at least to me, is unclear. We have a sealed pattern for the number 1 Mark 1. We don't actually have the sealed pattern, anymore at least, for the number 2 Mark 1, which is the Trocala variant, as it were. So they each get their own designation, but the Orbea does not. In any case, 30,000 in total of all 3 manufacturers are ordered, but about 6,000 are deemed to be, as I mentioned, not to specification, and so are rejected. Those end up on the civilian market. The 24,000 that are brought into service, as far as I know, there's every chance those saw actual wartime service. We don't have any with confirmed service history. Perhaps there's a regimental museum out there that does. I'd be interested to know if anyone knows of any with, say, regimental markings added to them, or they've come down through a family and they know that their great-grandfather or whatever was issued one of these Spanish old pattern revolvers. So they might be a bit of a footnote in British military history, and even an even smaller footnote in Spanish firearms history, but they are an interesting sort of international bit of the story when it comes to logistics and supply in a time of great difficulty and stress on the whole system. You basically become a bit desperate and you start buying something that's close enough, or as we used to say, good enough for government work. Thanks for watching, everyone, as always. Don't forget to do the obvious YouTube things, liking, subscribing, that sort of thing. And of course, we have our social media accounts you can check out: Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and our website as well for any events that might be coming up later in the year. And of course, our 3 sites. Please do come and visit us if you can, if you live in the UK or if you are visiting. They are well worth a visit. Thanks a lot. See you next time.